Hello and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast on video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. In this episode, Brian and I conclude our discussion of the Silent Hill 2 remake, focusing especially on the final boss. We again talk about this game's really uncanny and interesting structures of repetition and reduplication. We talk about the strangeness of the warehouse environment in which the fight takes place, and why spider bosses in games very often suck. A quick disclaimer about this section. I talk at one point about the game Bloodborne and these spider enemies with human heads. Um, and upon finishing the recording, I went and checked, and it turns out that I was wrong. What I say in the recording is that the human-headed spider enemies repeat exactly a model that we encounter early in the game. This is actually not true. They have a different head, so they're not exactly a copy of the character that I thought they were. And also, I don't know how I forgot this, but there are regular spider enemies in Bloodborne as well. So some of the thinking still holds. I stand by, I guess, some of the points, but take everything I say there with a bit of a grain of salt. Um, in the second half of this episode, we then turn to Bennett Sims's 2023 short story, The Postcard, from his collection Other Minds and Other Stories. This is a really cool story, explicitly inspired by Silent Hill, and we do get into the weeds a bit with Sims's language and particularly one sentence located towards the beginning of the piece. But I do hope that you'll find it interesting, especially those who have played Silent Hill or are familiar with the series. I think will have a lot to latch on to here. So we do hope you enjoy the conversation. So you beat Silent Hill 2 a few days ago, right?
Yeah, it was kind of I wasn't expecting because I was actually oddly expecting the game to be a bit longer at least. And I gotta say, I don't know if I'm curious how you thought about kind of like the latter parts of the game, but I was a little bit, I don't know, disappointed isn't really necessarily the right word, but the hotel part felt a little bit uh less engaging, I suppose, than some of the earlier parts of the game. Maybe it's an effect of, as we discussed, just kind of getting used to, the enemies and the being a little bit desensitized, but something about the hotel part, which feels like it should be one of the more intense, cathartic parts of the game. It felt a little bit disconnected to me in certain ways. Like even the puzzles felt a little bit kind of less relevant. I don't know if that makes sense to you or if that resonates at all.
Yeah, it does. I felt like my primary feeling during the hotel sequence was just exhaustion. There was a sense in which the game has this sort of like crunchy, just, as we discussed, immensely satisfying gameplay loop. And so I was more than happy to do puzzles and to shoot like monsters. But it did feel like there wasn't really anything new being added to the table. And it does have a sense of like, is this all really necessary, to what the game is trying to do? Or even like I sort of don't like using this phrase when it comes to games, but like is this necessary to the story the game is trying to tell?
Yeah, it's a little, part of what I was kind of thinking about the hotel is that I guess that, as I said, it feels like it should be a little more kind of meaningful and, a little more, I don't know, intense or something like that.
Yeah. Or I would even just say more surreal.
Yeah,
Like you kind of hit like a high point of surreality and disturbingness with the Abstract Daddy boss fight and the Labyrinth, which we should probably talk about.
yeah.
Um, and then you do have, yeah, again, like it just feels like a return to the quotidian, which maybe is the intended effect. But it feels like a long deflation rather than, a climax.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't feel as panicked or anything really in the hotel section. And I think maybe, I guess to just kind of set it up for later, that's maybe a point that can connect us to. the Bennett Sims story that we will discuss because I think that the hotel part feels in a way like mm, not mainly, but it feels like almost what he's kind of working with, at least formally and
Right.
atmospherically in the story. But one thing that one kind of thought I had that I wonder what you'll think about is that, Silent Hill, of course, is a game about um, psychology, but also memory. But our protagonist seems in an odd way to kind of have, at least at certain points, like no memory, or at least he's kind of
Right.
always forgetting things. So, for example, in the hotel, he watches this tape, which I don't, there's no explanation of why somebody, he or she or whatever taped this and how there's a tape of it, but he watches this tape of him, killing Mary uh, and at least in the final boss fight in my playthrough, he then, after killing the two pyramid heads, he sees Mary on that kind of like rooftop sort of place, and then just pretty quickly, like thinks it's her, right? Even though he like just got the confirmation, which to even need confirmation that he has killed her seems like he just has totally forgotten, right?
Right.
And then when he sees her, he like is convinced that it's her, before she starts attacking him, uh, which I think raises some interesting questions. And I do think this is kind of what one of the things that Sims like nicely has his finger on, which is um, he does mention, and this is a term that Clune uses, right? Like memory disease, right?
Mm.
Clune uses this in the context of addiction, but Sims uses it in the postcard to talk about like the the or not the protagonist, but the client's wife, right? The client's wife has a memory disease, but it seems like here James Sunderland has a memory disease, right?
Right, right. And I would just say quickly for reference, this is Michael Clune, and his
Yep,
book
yep.
Whiteout. It's The Secret Life of Heroin. Is that
Yeah,
the?
yeah.
Yeah. Amazing book, amazing author.
Hmm.
I wanted to, I mean, just touch on that final boss because you're making me realize now there is something jarring about the environment. Like first, to start on the basics, did you understand where that was taking place? The game is so um, you can say this, even with the hotel being, I think, somewhat, I don't know, dull in certain ways. There's such a concreteness to the locations, there's a kind of totemic quality, like the hospital, the prison, and the apartments, and then the labyrinth that kind of mushes them together.
Yeah.
But then what is that final space is so fascinating because it's essentially just like a warehouse.
Yeah, I was gonna say it seems like the upper floor of some kind of warehouse.
Which just comes totally out of left field. I mean, and what it reminds me of is just, you know, uh, it's a kind of prototypical or archetypal game space. I mean, warehouses feature very prominently in games because they're so simple. They're like perfectly geometric,
Well,
right?
they're anonymous too, right? And
They are anonymous.
they're often
Yeah,
abandoned, right?
and
Like
full
they're
of repetitive full of repetition of assets. You could repeat this, you could design just one container and just repeat it over and over again and build pathways with that. So a warehouse is like one of the, I want to say it's like one of the primordial 3D video game areas.
Mhm.
um Precisely because, yes, because it's anonymous, it's radically simple, it's as repetitious as you want it to be. It's drab, it doesn't have complicated textures, probably
Yeah.
doesn't have complicated lighting.
Hmm.
Um, so there are these technical reasons why it, it sort of has this outside presence in the, at least in the canon of like early 3D video games, which I would include PS2 at this point historically. Um,
Yep.
but it just seems like what work is it doing in the context of Silent Hill? I mean, it's also striking that it's during the day, right? Like there's sunlight streaming through the ceiling, as I remember, or through the windows.
Yeah.
So that also feels like a violation. Like I talk about at the end of the Bloodborne book, like how strange it is to see Yharnam during an actual sunrise.
Hmm.
Um, and there is something strange about, even though you do traverse Silent Hill and the hotel during the day, like this sort of, there's a sense in which it's suffused with light, and that's not true of maybe any other location in the game.
Yeah, it's a very dark game, and I think one of the things I said to you as I was kind of getting closer to the end is that definitely, and I would still probably say this, the most difficult boss fight is Eddie, because you're just completely in the dark, and like that was one place where my kind of anxiety got reactivated because the
Yeah.
whole, I mean, it's a disturbing, the cutscene is disturbing. We find out a couple little hints about, why Eddie is there, and if we didn't already know, right? This is a guy who was bullied, and he alludes to like killing a dog and maybe hurting one of his bullies or something like that, and then he just
Yeah.
kind of turns against James, right, and starts attacking him, and it's yeah, it's dark. I mean that was probably the last like really or one of the last really dark moments in the game for me where you're in like a meat locker with all these corp or whatever carcasses kind of hanging from hooks, and he's just shooting at you from the darkness, and then he runs up and hits you and whatever, right? I actually that was the most times I died in the game, I think was two or three times I had to go through it, and then I eventually got him. I figured out the strategy, but yeah, in terms of the brightness then of actually one other thing I'll say about the fight with Eddie is that it's so dark that um your movements will leave an impression. I don't know if you had this when you played or if you know what I mean, but if you raise your gun and then put it back down, there's this kind of like after image of your movements with your arms movements or whatever
Huh,
because
I didn't realize that.
yeah, maybe it's just the graphics that I the mode I was playing on or whatever. But yeah, there's this like uh almost the same way that if you look at an optical illusion or something and then you look away, you'll see the kind of imprint of that thing kind of impressed on your your optical senses or whatever. The same thing would happen because of how dark it is, right? Uh and so it was like truly just a visually dark but also disturbing, right? But then I think I agree, right? Like the final fight, which again is disturbing, and like troubling, but in a certain way it was not as difficult, but also not as unapproachable as some of the other moments in the game, which I was kind of surprised by, especially given that it's like a version of Mary, right? That's like kind of in this weird upside down structure, having to do, or at least referring to her illness and her bedbound condition before she died.
Hmm. Yeah, I didn't even make I'm such an idiot when it comes to games like themes in games. So I just I didn't even realize that it was a reference to her sort of immobility. That or sort of it's kind of like a yeah, it's sort of a torture chamber that moves essentially like a spider.
Yeah,
There again is something like archetypal about this fight, which I like. That's something I liked about it. Like, you
yeah,
know, it's basically a spider boss,
right.
which makes me think of Doom for one, like the original Doom. I think the bo and the 2016 remake ends with a spider, which I always find this is just pure anecdote or like pure personal sort of sheer opinion, as I like to say, but I always find spider bosses really lame. Like a spider is not a sort of a video game creature that inspires any feelings in me whatsoever. I
Yeah,
guess I don't have arachnophobia. I think spiders are really cool, but not cool enough that I want to fight them in games. And I feel like it's partly the moveset thing. I mean, this is maybe worth interrogating for a second. Like, just
yeah.
think about the spider boss as an archetype. Like, what is a spider really doing mechanically uh that adds an interesting wrinkle to the basic combat loop, Thinking of other archetypal game enemies, like a dragon can fly, right? It can breathe fire. It has i.e. it has a new axis of mobility and it has ranged attacks. It's also going to be really large. I mean, a spider, I feel like the most they're going to do is hit you with a web that immobilizes you. Does Mary hit you with it? She has a range attack, right? She has that crow, sort of like a crow magic spell or something.
Well, they're
Um,
they're they're the like moths or whatever that kind of go
right,
after
that's
you,
what I'm
which
thinking of. Yeah.
but I mean a couple things I'll say. First of all, I do have arachnophobia. Like I really I do think that, just in themselves spiders are really cool, but I something about them feels and this is just again like a kind of just a thought, but spiders, are like maybe like the owls of not insects because they're not technically insects, but they're, like almost like the owls of small things you'll find in your house. And what I mean is that they seem very intelligent. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure they're like incredibly strong for their size.
Hmm.
And also, the web, the idea of weaving a web like that, just kind of like auto constructively, whatever, they have like material where they can weave a web, which then uh, can trap their prey. Also, they hide in the darkness, right? Like they know to kind of get away from you if you're near them. They kind of hide and reproduce in the darkness. And then occasionally, I've had moments where a couple years ago, spiders really like to hang out in my bathroom where I live. So there's like a few years ago, we have these little spiders, they're not harmful or anything, but I'll see them crawling around on the ceilings. And uh, one time, whatever, one of them gave birth to, a bunch of offspring, and there were just all these tiny, tiny spiders crawling around in the bathroom ceiling, right? And so there's
How
something
cute.
about them where they seem very intelligent, but also, what's intelligent about them does not make sense to us. Like they have a kind of there's a kind of of course it's inhuman because they're not human, but there's a kind of method that they have or a kind
Mhm.
of strategy. And actually, we'll talk about this soon, I think, but Sims's story House Sitting actually features, literally a spider, but also the idea of spiders and webs pretty prominently. And it actually, uh, I think that's part of what he's getting at is this kind of idea of like madness. And he even actually uses a epigraph from a Thomas Bernhard novel, which I think we mentioned before, which is like spiders as nature's craziness, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so there's at once this incredibly intelligent, determined, intentional aspect to spiders, but for us, it's this kind of, we there is a sense of awe or wonder with them because we just totally can't compute what they're doing.
Is that true for you when it comes to spiders in games? I have a lot of thoughts based on what you just said, but I just did want to just throw that question out.
In terms of games, I mean, I think of the spider boss in it's like a spider, right? In Dark Souls, when you're in the after you go through Blight Town, when you get kind of to
Yes.
the bottom, there's the sort of spider boss, which is one of the easier, I think, bosses in the game. I mean, I think in games it doesn't work as well because it's a trope, as you said, right? It's like a kind of something you would expect, right? Like if there's anything that you would expect with horror, especially, right? Whether it's psychological horror or cosmic horror. I mean, in Lovecraft, even Haunter of the Dark, right? There's cobwebs everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Spiders are, they leave a mark when a place is abandoned, right? So if something has cobwebs all over it, it means that the place, usually at least, unless you just really love spiders and want to kind of cohabitate with them, usually means a place hasn't been visited or hasn't been maintained for a very long time. So
Yeah. I mean, oh, go
there's a
ahead.
well, no, I'm just saying there's a kind of sense in which you would expect spiders, right? And I think in that way, like the final boss being a kind of spider type boss, for me, that was part of why I didn't think it was, as effective or as interesting as some of the other, uh, more intense or more meaningful fights in Silent Hill 2.
Yeah, you would expect spiders is the new tagline for this podcast. I mean, Yeah, what you're saying makes so much sense. Again, and for me, I think the reason why I'm actually getting really interested in this, and I'm just working it out in my head, so maybe this is making no sense or it's like very all very obvious, but yeah, spiders are incredibly tropey when it comes to games. But it's not just that. Like it's hard for me to express how boring I find the spider as a video game antagonist.
Yeah.
But you're helping me. I again, I feel like maybe there's a kind of like mechanical or technical felicity in the spider. You know, um, in that you just pointed out a few more things that actually make the spider almost a perfect fit for the warehouse,
Mm.
as again an archetypal video game, as kind of archetypal video game content. Spiders connote, right, abandonment. And abandonment is always, again, like easier to build than a fully habitated life world.
Right.
An abandoned, apartment building is easier to implement in a game than a functioning, like lively, happy apartment building. Um, and so there's already a kind of uh, resonance or fittingness between the spider and the space that it occupies. But also, it strikes me that spiders, of course, like I was talking earlier about how factories or warehouses are, again, useful or fitting for games in that they sort of they naturalize repetition. They make repetition diegetically motivated, so you don't need to sort of pretend it's not there in the way you do if you see the exact same bookcase with the exact same books in two different houses in a game like Dishonored or something.
Mm.
Uh, but spiders do the same thing. Like spiders, what's the chief mark of a spider, like visually? It's repetition. It's like instead of having two eyes, they have what? A bunch of eyes. I don't know spiders. Are they eight eyes? They have a lot of eyes. And
Yeah.
instead of having two legs or four limbs, they have eight limbs. So it's again, it's like at the level of the individual entity, they are, you could say spiders just repeat assets. Uh, and that would also, I would imagine, make them it would be easier to include a spider as a boss than a dragon, right? Not that we would have a dragon in Silent Hill, that would be crazy.
Yeah.
Um, but again, like a dragon needs to be able to fly, which means it's going to be a much more complex sort of just technically on the level of physics, right? And spatial traversal and modeling, that's just all going to be exponentially more complicated. Uh, and so, like, what is a spider? You noted like the way in which spiders seem wise or cunning. I mean, that's something that's also very difficult to do in a game, like intentionality and thought process, right? Or even just strategy is going to be pretty advanced. Um,
Yeah.
like to have a spider-like AI and have that be markedly different from the AI of other enemies in the game is an interesting question or challenge. It's like if you were able to develop if you come up with some fancy AI for your NPCs, like why would you waste it on one boss, to make that boss different? Um, I don't know. The more I'm thinking Spider is like they're just a kind of blob made of repeated assets that moves around on the ground. That's just bigger than a normal biped. I really think on the formal level, this is why I find spiders just incredibly dull. Um,
Mm.
they're like a land-bound yeah, a kind of like a sort of copy pasting of a normal ass enemy, of a Doom trooper, but just sort of multiplied. And so all that said, I mean, I've convinced myself now that I mean, I don't think this is what Silent Hill is doing, but there is a kind of video game tradition I don't know, reflexivity happening here, like with the spider and the warehouse, as these two, these being like, again, like these canonical archetypal objects or entities that are here deployed at the same time. Um, there's a reading, which again is not, I think, the intended reading of Silent Hill. It's not what the game is trying to do, but it's almost like a parody of a video game final boss, you know?
Yeah.
uh, uh, like we needed a conclusion here. We already kind of had our conclusion with the Pyramid Head dying, who's the real antagonist of the game. Um, but here you go. Here's the real final boss, and we're just gonna hit you with a double whammy of of extreme tropes,
Yeah, well,
rather extremely familiar tropes.
one thought that comes to mind too, especially in a different kind of manner of repetition, as I kind of already alluded to, right? Like spiders proliferate. Like if you see a spider and you don't, kill it, or if you're more humane, put it outside or whatever, and you leave it alone, next thing you know, there are going to be 20 spiders, right? Like,
Right.
and every time it gets, to a certain point in the season, as I said, I've been seeing a bunch of spiders around and my cats will kind of follow them around and play with them and stuff. But, I know that if I didn't do anything, I would see more and more, right? It seems like every time I go in the kitchen or, take a shower or something, I see a spider on the ceiling. But I think that the odd thing, and maybe this is connected to the tropiness, is that in Silent Hill, right? It's when we have this kind of spider boss, which again, it's like a spider-like version of our protagonist's dead wife. It's
Right.
only
We
one,
should be
right?
clear on that. Yeah.
It's a singular spider, right? It's not like she has an army of little spiders. Actually, what she has the army of is moths, which are also, I mean, we've dealt with infestations as well in this apartment, right? And moths proliferate quite a bit as well.
Yeah.
But there is something, that like the repetition of repetition that a spider uh carries with it. Its ability to repeat patterns in a web, its repetitive limbs, the fact that it can just kind of, yeah, I mean, have lay eggs or whatever and multiply itself into a bunch of identical spiders that are at least identical to our eyes.
Yeah, no, you're totally right too. I didn't even think about how a web is also a paradigm of both repetition and symmetry.
Yeah.
And I should say, my reading of the final boss was actually that was Maria, not Mary, um, which I didn't go and confirm who it is. But either way, it's even that there is an ambiguity there is interesting. And of course, Mary seems to be endlessly repeated too. Like she dies
Mhm.
and she comes back, and
Yeah.
she appears in different guises. And so, in fact, the singularity of Maria is precisely what's being put under pressure in Silent Hill. I mean, that is an explicit intended aspect of the game, is you take the singular person from James's life and multiply her. That's the classic doppelganger. That's the classic instance of the uncanny, where what shouldn't be repeated is repeated. We talked about this on an earlier episode too.
Yeah,
Uh,
so
yeah,
Maria's like a repetition of Mary, and I think you're right. So she looks like Mary before you actually get into the boss fight, but James calls her Maria, at least in
yeah.
my playthrough. And I do think there are different. I think like even the lead up to the fight, even before your, game kind of ending. I'm pretty sure that the lead up to the fight can go a couple different ways based on how you've played through the game and like
Mhm.
your interactions with Maria. I've only finished it the once, so I haven't confirmed this, but that's what I've seen at least doing a little bit of research. And so that's interesting, right? So there's this kind of odd, and I think this is where we also see the Lynchian aspect, right? I mean, it's totally you know, something like Lost Highway, right? Where uh, characters kind of switch places. There's a version of the protagonist's or the main character's wife who uh just kind of appears as like a doppelganger of her, and then he also like switches into a different person. So I think that's where we see some of that sort of surreal influence on the game. But yeah, I don't know. It's
I
an
mean, I think thinking of doppelgangers and repetition is as good a segue as any into the Bennett Sims story that
sure.
we promised to talk about a few episodes ago.
Yeah.
But I do wonder if we should just like should we venture a theory of what? So let's take as what we're proposing here. One could of course argue with it, but what we're proposing is a kind of like archetypal like uber conventional quality, conventionality for almost like reified or made incredibly explicit or overt in the spider boss in the warehouse that you have at the end, that tacked on to the very end of the game. Um, do you have any theory of like what that conventionality is doing for Silent Hill? like what the intention could be there if we're bracketing the possibility that it's a kind of explicit gesture toward the video game medium and the traditions of the action game, or the survival horror game. Um, what is at stake, particularly when I mean, just noting again the deviation of this final environment that sort of comes out of nowhere. That's not an environment that we've seen anywhere, right? And seems to be utterly without context. Like maybe that's the point. Factory, prison, apartment, these all bear heavy connotations and context and seem quite related in certain ways to James's own life, which would make sense because we're in Silent Hill and it's all a kind of emanation of his psyche. But an empty warehouse seems to be totally random, right? Like James, I mean, I don't think it's implied that he works at a warehouse. Like where is in his unconscious where is this space even coming from? Um, we don't actually go to a factory in this game, although a factory figures prominently in the Sims story again to keep gesturing forward.
Yeah.
Um, so do you have any sense of again, like just to circle back to our first question, like do you have any sense of what this fight is doing on a kind of thematic or artistic level?
Well, what one thought, I don't know if this is how related this is, but one kind of thought that I had is, while sort of finishing the game is actually a couple things. I want to circle back to something we talked about last time too, but the first thing is that it's still when you play through the game, and we talked about this off the pod, but there are these super discreet and sort of easily missable hints that for me are at least part of what makes the game so disturbing. So, you go through, you read these notes, these memos, a lot of them they're not relevant for what you need to know to actually play the game, but there are these kind of, no, especially in the hospital, in the jail, there are these kind of little notes that you'll find that
Mhm.
hint towards some like pretty dark stuff, but they're not even necessarily relevant to James, right? They're just about, prisoners doing things or prisoners escaping, but they have these pretty dark undertones. Um, but getting through the whole game, like we get the sense of what happened, right? Like we understand like in general, I guess, like in a general sense, what Silent Hill is, why people are there. Because we also, we know that it's not just James who's there, right? There are a couple other people who are there, and they're there for these in a way seemingly to like kind of work through or not work through these kind of traumatic things that have happened to them. But we still at the end have kind of no explanation, right? So even if we're talking again about like lore, right? There's no real resolution, and I know
Yeah.
the game has different endings depending on how you play through it and how you interact with the other characters. And I do think that that's a really sort of interesting aspect of the game, and maybe one that can be brought to bear on that final boss fight and the kind of, maybe let down that it seems to be. But the other thing I'll say that you mentioned, I think last time, is I will now agree that something about just the playerly setup and experience of the game definitely feels cozy. Like when I
Mhm.
finished the game, I wanted to actually start it again. Like
Me too.
I
Me
haven't
too.
yet, but it feels like uh, there's something about, whatever the mechanics of the game and the way that those mechanics are offset by the story and the environments and the atmosphere that feels like, you know, very precise and just really pleasurable. And I think this also goes back to our discussion of like form and violence, maybe, or like form and horror, where you can have like incredibly disturbing things happening, but there's still a kind of, you know, aesthetic pleasure that we get going through them when it's a work of art.
Yeah. Yeah, totally agree. And I guess I just want to go on the record here before we move on, to say I would be happy if I never fought another spider boss in a video game again. And with that statement, yeah, I just want to underscore how, again, just how shitty spider bosses genuinely are. I would actually say I liked this one, but that's a kind of different conversation. And I've talked myself into really admiring again, the sort of thematized conventionality of this final encounter. But I partly wanted to make this pronouncement now because I imagine there are spider bosses in our future and in this podcast's future. And I now feel that whenever we encounter a spider boss, we are obligated to close read it. Um,
Sure.
I also one more thing occurred to me, which I just wanted to mention. At some point someday I'll stop talking about Bloodborne, but it's I haven't sort of I haven't escaped from its shadow yet. But there are spiders in Bloodborne, and they are a kind of joke at precisely at asset repetition. So the only spiders to my memory that you see in Bloodborne are spiders with human heads. And when you encounter them, they're in the Nightmare of Mensis, which is the kind of like topsy-turvy madhouse world that you go to at the very end.
Mhm.
And there are repetitions on so many levels. So the spider, and I don't talk about this in the book at all, but I sort of now I'm almost wishing that I did. So there are, of course, they have repetition in their limbs. They are as an enemy repeated, and in fact, when they appear, they are a kind of jarring deviation if you want to put yourself in that headspace, insofar as they are a repetition of a person who was supposed to be singular. So the character of Patches, who's a kind of scoundrel coward character who appears in all of the Souls games. His version, the version of Patches in Bloodborne, is a spider with a human's head. And so let me see if I can just unpack this for a second, or trace out all the different lines. So on the one hand, uh, Patches is himself a repetition, right? He's in every game. It's not explained really why he's in every game, as far as I know. Um, so he erodes the singularity, say, of Bloodborne, Elden Ring, and Dark Souls, even though those are ostensibly all different worlds, different fictional universes. Um, but within the logic of Bloodborne, he's a singular being, and when you first meet him, you're like, "Huh, that's funny. That's weird. I haven't seen that before. It's a spider with a man's head."
Yeah.
Then in the Nightmare of Mensis, you find a repetition of that singular mutation or deviation, right? There are multiple spiders with men's head. I think all with the same head. It's just the same model. It's the Patches model repeated, as far as I remember. Um, at the same time, one of the gimmicks and frankly, like really funny jokes of the Nightmare of Mensis is precisely that it's a world in which the game starts recombining its own assets. So throughout Bloodborne, you face dogs and crows. They're one of the kind of baseline enemies. They're all over the city. But when you get to the Nightmare of Mensis, you find crows with dogs' heads and dogs with crows with dogs' heads and dogs with crow's heads. So why am I'm confusing myself. Anyway, they've swapped bodies and heads.
Hmm.
And in a way, it's partly a kind of joke about asset repetition. It's a case of like very cannily motivated asset repetition where instead of coming up with brand new enemies, the game just takes the enemies it already has and just splices them together in goofy new ways. And the sort of reveal in that stage is precisely the spiders with human heads. Um, but the spiders and humans are not combining a regular enemy, i.e., a spider, and another regular enemy, a human. The spiders and human heads are instead doing a kind of asset repetition of the combination itself, uh, i.e., Patches.
Right.
So there's just like all these different levels of like motivated repetition that's also just like quite thrifty from an asset and game design standpoint. It works in Bloodborne to a certain point. I find it still a little bit like cheap, a little bit like, well, couldn't we just get some new enemies too? You know?
Yeah.
Um, but it's sort of funny. It's thematically quite on point. But I think the key thing I'm trying to emphasize here is just the way in which that game does seem to be explicitly playing with ideas of repetition across bodies and between bodies. Um, in the way that Silent Hill I don't think is in any way. But it's another case where there's a kind of foregrounding of conventionality or tiredness, or repetition that does make it sing in a way that it maybe doesn't in other contexts.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, I mean, I will maybe defend partly Bloodborne because I do think that that sort of repetition ad absurdum or whatever lends to the uncanny quality of a lot of, again, the enemies, the environments.
Yeah.
And we've talked already about finding the second or the original or whatever version of the Hunter's Dream. And, this happens in other Souls games as well. But yeah, I think with enemies too, it's an interesting thing that happens. And it's actually, I think you're right. It's something that actually, in a way, can't happen in, at least not in the same way in Silent Hill, because the enemies, as we've already discussed, like there are only what, like three different main kinds of enemies, and they or I guess four, and they only have there are a couple of variations, right? There are the mannequins that can climb on the ceiling and the walls, and then there's the more toxic, weird, straight-jacketed enemies, but that's it. And they're all repeated, they're all anonymous. So it's a different kind of repetition. I think this kind of way of looking at different modalities of repetition is something that I'm sure we'll keep thinking about together across many different games. But these, Bloodborne and Silent Hill are pretty good places to point that out for sure.
Definitely. Should we move on to Bennett Sims?
Yeah, yeah. Um, so yeah, the postcard, right? We kind of hinted at this a little while ago in our one of our other episodes on Silent Hill, but this one, and I already mentioned this, but Sims pointed out when I interviewed him that partly, I think the way he even phrased it was that this story was partly a way of working through his experience of playing Silent Hill.
Mhm.
And so there is a, and we've talked about his other story, Portinaccio Sarcophagus, uh, in a different episode, but he's definitely thinking quite a bit about not only other literary references, but also, of course, Silent Hill, but also, Lynch. I think even in other stories, uh, he has specifically Lost Highway in mind, right? One thing that I want to maybe open it up with, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts about this, I guess, is that uh, this story formally to me seems, of course, formally it makes a lot of sense that it's it's inspired by or has Silent Hill 2 in mind, but there's none of the, I mean, there's mist and fog and things like that, right? And there are these kind of even buildings that seem to shift depending on the perspective, right? So there's like there's a question about, is it a hospital? Is it a prison? Is it a factory? There's this kind of ambiguity about what these structures are. But at the same time, it doesn't have, and I think this is to its credit, it doesn't have the same kind of explicitly, disturbing or unsettling uh, atmosphere as Silent Hill. I don't know if you would agree or if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, like it's we said this about Portnature sarcophagus actually,
Mhm.
but I think it's a horror story only to the extent that it's dealing with the horror of dementia, which is maybe the most gripping terror you can imagine in certain from a certain perspective. Um, as far as like the trappings of actual horror, with the grotesque, right? The gothic, none of that's really there. It's got the fog and the sort of sense of just pervading desolation,
Yeah.
and emptiness, which is distinctive of the game. But it feels more like a Hitchcock scenario in a lot of ways than a gothic horror scenario or even a Lynchian horror scenario.
Yeah.
Um, I do think we should just give a little bit of context for the story. Do you want to take it hand at just like um summarizing it a bit. I just partly because you also know Sim so much better than I do.
Sure, yeah. So it's a story that we've discussed Portnaccio sarcophagus, which is written in this long kind of block paragraph that goes on for, I don't know, 20 something or 30 pages, which is something Sims has done in a few different stories of his. including another one in the same collection, which is the collection, by the way, is Other Minds and Other Stories. It's his 2023 collection of stories. There's another story in there called Introduction to the Reading of Hegel, which is also a one, 30 something page single paragraph that touches on, I guess in a similar way has like this kind of anxiety to it, but is again this like long uh Bernhardian paragraph. But the postcard is different. Postcard is written in these uh very telegraphic and again like clearly it's supposed to mimic, the messages that might be included on the back of a postcard, but every, paragraph or line break or whatever is a single sentence, right? And not only that, but in contrast from a story like Portinacio sarcophagus, the even the syntax is very different. So here we have a lot of run-on kind of comma splices and things like that, whereas something like Portinacio sarcophagus is very grammatically complex and precise. Here it feels a lot more not conversational, but a little bit more casual, I suppose.
Mhm.
In terms of the story, right? We have a narrator who is just kind of a blank slate. We don't know anything about the narrator, but they seem like some kind of, private detective or something like that who has a client who's an older lawyer who shows, shows the narrator a postcard that's, ostensibly or seems to be from his wife who is dead. So it's similar setup to Silent Hill. Um, And so this client hires the narrator to go to this place, which is called Ocean View, and sort of track down, go to this motel, Ocean View Motel, go to room 315. So unlike, I think in Silent Hill 2, it's room 312, but here it's room 315. So go there and just kind of figure out what's going on, right? Um, and so we get this kind of, the narrator travels there. He has the room key. He goes and tries to search out who could have possibly sent this postcard. And as we get to the end of the story, things as as you would kind of expect, things get a little more complicated. Things are pretty eerie. But again, I guess I'll just like kind of point out again that there's not ever really there's a I guess like there is an unsettling sense, but there's no real sense of danger, I guess, right? It's not explicit. Um, and by the end of it, we find the narrator kind of locked into this bizarre scenario where he's in a room with an elderly woman and he's kind of trapped in the room, and it seems like, much like in Lynch and other kind of surreal or uncanny works of horror, we have like a structure that's already in place that the characters almost like come to embody or come to fit into just by pure fact of being there, I
Right.
suppose, or by investigating something. They like come to take on the characteristics or the positions of characters who have maybe always existed, right? There's kind of like a cyclical nature to it.
Yeah, and he also assumes the position essentially of his client, right? I mean, like
Yeah.
we learn in the very beginning that this investigator always ta generally takes the name of his client when doing work, right? When checking into the hotel, and here he doesn't. But in some ways, the trajectory of the story is a kind of like filling out of the role of the client until they become more or less indistinguishable by the end of the story. At least that's how I read it. Um, which is another form of replication or symmetry between bodies, between identities. I could also just add that we have also this sort of in conjunction with this interest in sort of lateral repetition, you might say. There's also the sort of vertical repetition of repetition in time.
Mhm.
This whole scenario arises out of, as you said, what the story calls a memory disease in the client's wife. But also we have deja vu is invoked from the first pages when we talked about this at the end of a previous episode, but when the um, the narrator is driving into and I keep wanting to say Silent Hill, driving into Ocean View and passes the very point that's depicted on the postcard, and says I had entered the, I think, let me see if I can get, I want to get the exact words here. I had trespassed into the terrain or the district of deja vu. Um, I actually think it's worth pausing on that sentence just because I brought it up at the end of the earlier episode. Um, but there's a lot to chew on there, and it sort of continued to turn over in my mind since we sort of invoked it very briefly earlier. Um, the narrator says, "I had crossed over that border that separates what is familiar from what is strange. I had trespassed into the terrain or the district of deja vu." So the general point I wanted to make first, just to backtrack, is that deja vu would be a repetition in time, a kind of like, as it were, a vertical repetition, if that spatial metaphor makes any sense at all.
Mhm.
But we also have like repetition within the sentence, or at least a kind of mirroring. Um, I think I asked previously, like, why we have these two options, the terrain or the district, and also what it means to trespass into the district or terrain of deja vu. Partly because deja vu would seem to be usually, it implies a kind of lack of agency, right? Like one doesn't submit themselves to deja vu. Deja vu afflicts a person.
Right.
It's completely beyond the will. And yet, what's being suggested here is that the narrator themselves is kind of essentially willing deja vu at an abstract level, and that they're crossing some spatial threshold, which I think really subs for some kind of mental or psychological threshold, right, into a space or a state of existence in which deja vu becomes expected, right? One expects spiders and one expects deja vu.
Yeah.
Um, and then there's the repetition or the duplicality of terrain and district. And the only thing, I said I'd been turning this over in my mind. I don't think I haven't come up with anything or any actual readings of it. I mean, the one thing that strikes me here is that terrain is perhaps more natural and district is cultural or societal. That we have, you could say we have nature and culture or the non-human and the human. The non-human or the human demarcations of our understandings of space, or location, right? Um,
Yeah.
I'm not sure what to do with that. This is very foggy. I'm just kind of working it out as we go. But I do think the kind of the stark difference between in meaning or suggested sort of right connotation between these two words seems to be intended or seems to be doing some kind of work on the level of the sentence or the passage.
Yeah, I think you've pointed out something pretty important, which is, yeah, this kind of both the, as you said, like the human and non-human, right? Like a terrain is geographical, whereas a district is, uh not legal, but what would the term be? Like legislative or something, right?
Yeah,
Like
like a district is a fiction, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's
yeah.
the terrain changes based on reality, based on material reality of like what is underfoot. You know,
Mm, yeah.
a district is essentially is a property of mapping, or
Right.
as you say, of legislation, of abstract borders being um, uh, projected onto an existing space.
So a district is like narrative. And I
Hmm.
wonder, like, especially this idea of deja vu is making me think about in my book, in my chapter on Remainder by Tom McCarthy, right? There's the narrator invokes deja vu at a certain point, right? That's like kind of the origin of his whole project, is having this intense sense of deja vu when he sees a crack in the bathroom wall at a party, and that's what launches his entire endeavor, right? This kind of feeling he has of deja vu as being precisely, and I think he uses this term like authentic, right? It's like a kind of experience where he feels natural, authentic, and actually like watching Mean Streets with Robert De Niro is kind of his touchstone for that in a certain way. And I think like that's right. And I think part of this is maybe what contributes to like the unsettling aspect of not just this story, but other stories by Sims, is that the self-awareness of that danger, right? Like the self-awareness of a character knowing that they are inhabiting something, right? Like they're able to name, this is the district or terrain of deja vu specifically, or in house sitting, right? Like the narrator in house sitting, uh, like essentially becomes obsessed with the quote unquote madness of the owner of the cabin that they're looking after, right? So they like start investigating, oh, why is the cabin set up like this? Why are there all these dream catchers? The owner must be insane. And then by the end of the story, we kind of have this again cyclical thing where the sort of protagonist becomes or falls into the position that the thing they are investigating or the person they're investigating seems to have in their mind, right? And so here to have deja vu be that thing, which yeah, we've discussed and is, it's like a passive experience, right? We can't just like make ourselves have deja vu, but just like in Silent Hill, Silent Hill, the location is this place where all these uncanny, repetitions, anonymity, disturbing events, and uh, occurrences which seem, shared by the characters, but also kind of like tailored to their own specific, uh, again, like traumas or experiences, seems like a real terrain of like a dark, dark kind of deja vu. Uh,
Mm.
and so that seems to maybe be like an acknowledgement of that. Because again, like Sims said specifically that this story is really heavily influenced by Silent Hill 2. And he even said at one point, he says that uh, he can appreciate that Silent Hill 2 is essentially Lost Highway the game or Solaris the game. uh,
Yeah.
which I find, like makes a lot of sense, and I think that's a nice thing to kind of think about, right? Because this is not just about horror; it's also about this kind of structure, or yeah, like you said, like I think you said vertical or lateral repetition. It's also just kind of like a metonymous repetition, right? Like if you're repeating a position, it's not even there is almost like a timelessness to it, right? Like it's not that I think the easy way to think about it would be, oh, well, the narrator's client is dooming the narrator into this like cycle of becoming him, and then the narrator is going to have to dupe some other person who comes later to do it, but it's no, it's like both things at the same time, right? So it's this kind of metonymy, which I think is distinct from a more maybe simpler or more recognizable kind of cycle of cursedness, which is, we see in a lot of horror films and things like that.
Yeah, yeah. I want to flash back. I just the idea of metonymy is interesting. I feel like we should gloss that, just because even as a literary scholar, I get confused by metonymy all the time. The literary device of metonymy as opposed to something like metaphor. But I wanted to flash back to Remainder first because you brought up Tom McCarthy's Remainder, which is that 2003. Uh,
I think it was 2005, but it was like written. I forget the exact years. It was like written
okay, yeah.
one year and it was published in a different year.
Okay, yeah. So either way, first decade of the 21st century, now classic novel in which an unnamed narrator suffers some kind of accident and gets a huge payout from a company or something, a legal payout that allows him to start actually trying to he has lost his memory, but he gets these strong instances of deja vu in certain cases that he finds a kind of deep, almost like aesthetic, but also just physical pleasure in.
Mhm.
And so I'm glad you brought this up because it actually is precisely the text that complicates what I said before about how you can't will deja vu. Because you could say that the narrator of Remainder, that's exactly what he's doing. He uses his immense financial resources to recreate entire spaces from ostensibly from his past, although it's never quite clear if they're actually from his past,
Yeah.
so that he can sort of or reenact certain things he's experienced just so he can have that sort of intense feeling of deja vu. Um, it's still complicated in that he's not willing the deja vu itself. That's impossible. What he's doing is willing the conditions for that deja vu to occur. I feel like I'm trailing off a little bit, but I just like this is something I want to think about more. The terrain or the district of deja vu is just a really suggestive pairing for me, even more so now than when we talked about it earlier.
Well, I think there's like an admixture of the two, right? So whether it's deja vu or something like aesthetic experience, or even in the example of remainder, right? Like you could do an economic reading or, kind of a critical reading of the financial and, aspects of the novel and how that, which you kind of partly have to do, right? Like that's what makes possible this narrator's experience. But again, what he's after is the same feeling over and over again, right? So
Mhm.
that's two different things. He on the one hand creates these scenarios, and as you said, like he's trying to recreate or reenact this situation, which, his mistake, I guess, as I've, termed it, is to think that you can and this is an example we see in plenty of places, plenty of works of literature, but to think that you can sustain or kind of invoke a certain experience just due to the material factors surrounding you, right? That's what he tries to do. Um,
Mm.
but I think what's instructive about that is that, he's not interested actually in those scenarios at all, right? He's interested in uh, precisely because he recognizes that those scenarios have, uh, and again, another little side note, I think it's important that it's unclear whether they're memories or not, right? Whether they're imaginary or because he's another kind of amnesiac character. Um,
But that's also true of deja vu, as we discussed.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and it's something like meaningless, right? It's something incidental, right? And so it's not just, he's building. This is the difference between what happens in Remainder and what happens in Against Nature by Huysmans is that Huysmans is specifically trying to just create like a really aesthetically curated home for himself where he can just be in solitude and, have these kind of experiences because of art. In Remainder, there's, art isn't a concern, it's the scenario, right? And so he's after a similar kind of authenticity, or that I think that is the term that he uses. But again, like he doesn't, it's not really important to him, like, it's not these, moments of distinction or cultural, cachet or whatever. It's all these kind of mundane things. It's a woman cooking liver. It's a woman taking out her trash. It's a guy playing the piano a few floors up. So they are these, at least some of them are these kind of ambient experiences, right? They're these kind of experiences of just like existing in an apartment building with all these different kind of people living around him. And what's important about that is that he doesn't see, or he is able to kind of bracket or disregard, again, like the economic and the artificial aspects of what happens. But of course, that, if you read the novel, you see that gets ramped up, right? Like it ends with him hijacking a plane, right? Like there's a, so there is a kind of because he's after the same feeling, that scenario kind of stops working and he has to jump to a new scenario. But I think, trying to return a little bit to the postcard, this idea of deja vu being both or having both a terrain and a district, I think is important, right? And it's another moment where Sims acknowledges like our critical capacities as readers, right? He's almost anticipating that, yeah, deja vu is both things, right? Like we can read the materials of the situation, but we can also read that actual experience and how it both depends, but also exceeds or transcends what that situation is in the first place, right? So every time you have deja vu, it's in a specific moment. You're, whatever, you're walking down the street or you're making a cup of coffee or whatever, right? So it happens in a specific moment, but that specific moment is simply, the catalyst or the instigator or the trigger for the feeling, which is the more, you know, interesting or important aspect of it. But to
Mm.
have an entire zone, which is, uh, you know, the zone and by zone, I'm meaning to include both terrain and district, a zone of deja vu kind of complicates that a bit. And that's what I think like kind of explodes it out of that more purely aesthetic or, phenomenological understanding of deja vu into something that gets a little more uncanny or yeah, a little more aligned with like the concerns we have when we think about horror.
Hmm. Yeah, the last bit you just said about how the zone folds in both words is itself really interesting. And again, I'm kind of just spiraling today. I apologize both to you and to anyone listening to this. But it just makes me think of another Andrei Tarkovsky film, not Solaris, but Stalker, probably his
Sure.
best known film, where it's about a place, a kind of um, yeah, it's about this mysterious sort of void land, contaminated, I don't know, mystical area called the Zone, which in that case does actually seem to be specifically, or at least from our perspective, like it does productively and I think usefully bring in exactly those two meanings of like the abstractly demarcated area on a map and a certain kind of terrain, a certain kind of like real physical or supra-physical existence, you know.
Yeah, the other thing, I maybe one more kind of connecting thing or more general thing that I've noticed about Sims's work, and I'm sure he's going to be, he'll be returning again, I guess, to our discussions. But the idea of a zone or terrain or district or whatever having a sort of whether it's psychological or just more purely experiential effect or tendency or uh, it's actually a nice way to fold in atmosphere again.
Mhm.
Uh, is something that, yeah, I mean, Sims is both explicitly and implicitly thinking about this in his writing, right? So here he explicitly says, like, yeah, I'm in the, I'm in the terrain of deja vu, right? That's like a pretty explicit and already very thought-provoking idea. But I think as we'll see when we discuss house sitting, um, eventually the protagonist there, thinks a lot about how, for example, an overgrown cabin with this, kind of bare bones, very sparse, spare, you know, cabin in the woods that's overgrown with grass and weeds and everything, how that environment itself can both mirror, but also and so it's not even causal, it's more like a coincidence or correlation, but it can both mirror but also potentially cause a certain, psyche or psychological profile or psychological effect. And I think, of course, again, as we see in Silent Hill, as we've been discussing, it's a place, that does this, right? We have to, if we zoom out a little bit, we have to imagine that the world that these characters live in when they're not in, Silent Hill, which I think is supposed to be up in Maine somewhere, uh, their regular lives in the world they live in is not, populated by these weird, faceless enemies and all this kind of dark stuff, right? It's just a specific place. And yeah, I don't really know what to make of that. I do think it's a really both in the postcard and in Silent Hill, it's a sort of instrumentalization of place in order to again evoke, cause, and correlate with certain experiences and mental states.
Yeah, yeah. And that emphasis on place maybe brings us, maybe here's one way we can sort of um link back up with Silent Hill or link the story back with Silent Hill, which is or sorry, let me try one more time. Link the sentence in the story we've been discussing back to Silent Hill. In a video game, terrain is such an important factor, right? Like the primordial sort of unit of space for a game is the platform and the platformer, and that's a kind of terrain. Or we can think of something as complex as Death Stranding, the video game Death Stranding, which is all about modeling different kinds of terrain and actually making us feel the force of different terrain.
Mm.
But in a game, like every terrain is also a district because games are so intentionally structured. You know, I mean, there are certain cases, procedurally generated games where we might have something closer to nature, right? Where we don't have districts in the same way. But a game like Silent Hill certainly is district all the way down, even when we're inhabiting something that feels like it should be pretty close to nature. Um, and so maybe again, like not, another way to say another way of saying that is that games are essentially zoned, and that they're always both. In fact, maybe we can never make a distinction between district and terrain in a video game. Um, I'm thinking maybe we leave off there, since I know you have to run. But I thought before we go, I imagine there'll be some of the people, if anyone is listening to this podcast, will, maybe familiar with Silent Hill and maybe less familiar with the story. I mean, Brian, can you think of like I do think anyone who's into Silent Hill should read this story. I mean, it's a really interesting, cool story on its own merits, but also like if you're a fan of the game, it feels like an essential companion in some ways. Do you have like a pitch? Like, can you think of a pitch to listeners like who are maybe curious, like why they should read this story?
Yeah, I think it does something that I always appreciate when I kind of learn about, and I really liked, I guess, hearing this when I spoke with Sims, which is that it's not like, it's not a novelization of Silent Hill or whatever, right? There's not a character named James Sunderland. There's not these kind of enemies. There's no gore. There's no combat. Nothing like that. But I think what's interesting about it and what is actually pretty difficult to do, and I won't say in an adaptation because this is also not an adaptation, but just in something that's, inspired by or has a different work in mind. What it does is really, for me, revisiting the story after finally playing the game, it does illuminate some of the more formal aspects of the game that are really interesting. And I think that's partly because um, the game in a way is about these kind of empty structures, right? Like we don't really get a resolution to the story. We don't really understand, and this is something we've already discussed, but I think at least in my opinion, sometimes the most interesting, whether it's horror, but also, other genres and even just kind of more abstractly or generally, the most interesting and compelling stuff is oftentimes stuff that can't be explained away, right? Which keeps it alive for us. And so I think that the kind of inscrutability, the kind of sparseness of this story does a really good job in itself as a standalone piece, but also, will make you kind of think about that, I guess, when you go back to playing Silent Hill, right? There's no one, I mean, there are, at least when I first started playing, there were these jump scares, there were these moments where I got really kind of terrified and anxious and everything, but the game has a lasting effect that isn't really locatable in any of those specific moments. It's kind of more you could say atmosphere, but I think it's also formal, right? It's something about the absence that the game kind of evokes, and the story does the same thing.
Yeah, and I mean, the last bit on absence just made me think about how the story so powerfully and brilliantly unfolds the way in which the postcard, which is again the title, the genre or the form of the postcard is itself fundamentally about absence, or invokes or creates or rather, what's the word I'm trying to signifies a kind of absence. And we could say this is a story that is just it's really good at using the kind of its own material of language, and narrative to explore and produce an effective absence. Um, I don't know. Should we wrap there? Is that a decent place to end?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'll just add one more thing, which is that as you highlight there, and it's a really good point to kind of emphasize again, is that yeah, the postcard is always sent to you from um, somewhere where you're not, right? Um, and so it's addressed to you from elsewhere. And both, in terms of some of the memos you pick up or some of the things that are specifically addressed to James Sunderland in the game Silent Hill 2, uh, that lines up, very nicely with that, right? There's a lot about letters and these kind of impossible letters or letters written from a point outside of time or a point in the past or, some uh, kind of bewildering moment or person. But there's also, again, like maybe coming back, and this is maybe the final thing I'll say, is that uh, thinking about a location or a zone as having to do with or being kind of controlled by or concerned with deja vu is a way that a place itself can be addressed to a
Mm.
specific character or person, right? Like everything in Silent Hill, as we come to kind of find out, is addressed to James, right? And that's part of especially because you're playing as James, right? That's part of what makes the game so intriguing, especially because we don't always know how or why it's addressed to him, right? Like it's addressed to him and we're playing as him, but we don't always get the pieces of the puzzle, I suppose.
Right. And I mean, as Sims's narrator notes, like another distinguishing aspect of the postcard as a form is that it permits no response or allows no response. It's a one-way communication. And the story includes the really compelling and fascinating line that ghosts are a kind of postcard because ghosts are a one-way communication from death or from the beyond.
Right.
Um, and of course, all of these notes that we're finding in Silent Hill are also one-way communications. Like we could say that even letters in Silent Hill are, in Sims's definition, postcards because they may be addressed, from a doctor to a patient or between doctors or something, but they're really addressed to the player. They're really addressed, in fact, to James, and you can't respond to them.
Right.
So maybe games are postcards too in that way.
Sure. I like that.
Do you want to say something to close us out, or should we
Well,
just call it? Yeah.
for once, I'll just remind you, Nathan, to keep that magic lantern lit.
Will do, Brian. Take care.
You too.